Trump economic advisor Art Laffer recently said this regarding the minimum wage on Fox News. Let's take a listen.
For those people, Sandra, who are coming into the labor force brand fresh, not old timers who've been around for a while, the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised, those with less education, young people who haven't had the job experience, these people aren't worth $15 an hour in most cases.
Writer and publisher of The Ink, Anand Giridharadas, debated Art Laffer on the Mehdi Hasan show, particularly blasting his championing of supply-side and trickle-down economics. Let's take a listen to that.
I think it's, to be honest, time to have an honest talk about your legacy in this issue. I mean, it's fine for you to decry what ProPublica is reporting, but the truth is you are one of the architects of this legacy of misery in this country. You've dedicated your life to the kind of pseudo-intellectual ammunition for the plutocratic hijacking of this country that ProPublica reports. You, through your advocacy of supply-side economics and trickle-down, have a legacy of hurt and pain and stagnation that is unparalleled among economists. That homeless vet that I walk by on the street who is hurt by gutted government programs, he is your handiwork, Arthur Laffer, and you know that.
Listen, Ryan and I are going to...
No lies detected.
Ryan and I are going to have, I think, sharp disagreements on this, but I will say that I think both of those clips together are really interesting because my take on the original Laffer clip is what made the headlines the most was the first thing that he said, where he said, they're not worth $15 an hour, which is incredibly callous. And it's a great example of how the conservative movement has way too often spoken from the perspective of the capitalists and the plutocrats without actually speaking about people like human beings. And so it's a really good example of that. But if you keep going, he says we're creating a permanent underclass because of this technology that is replacing the people and is a killer for the people who need help the most. And there's a disconnect between the way he's speaking about workers in the first half of it and the way he's speaking about workers in the second half. And I think that's a great, the debate that Mehdi Hasan is hosting on that show is fantastic. It's a perfect example of what needs to happen in the country. You need to have Art Laffer going up against Anand. Like, you need to have the airing of these like strong disagreements so that we can sort of work through and find out what the actual truth is. But I think at the end of the day, what the Laffer clip exposes is the poor, I guess, strategy, or I guess it's not even a strategy. It actually does stem from a corporatist ethos that consumed the conservative movement for years because things were going great for the upper class in the 1980s and the 1990s. It did create a lot of jobs. It did create a lot of wealth for people who needed it, actually. And that's where I would take issue with what Anand said when he's saying the homeless veteran is Art Laffer's handiwork. I think that's absurd. I think there are actually a lot of people who have wealth and have careers and great jobs. And I would say that they are Art Laffer's handiwork. There are benefits. You know, two things can be true. There are benefits to a market economy and there are problems with the market economy. But it is absolutely accurate that the conservative movement and the right and Republican Party more broadly has been overly consumed with this corporatist, callous and cold sort of embrace of only the benefits of the market economy with no regard or little regard or too little regard for the disadvantages of it. And that has been a massive failure.
Right. But here's why it was fair. So innovation and productivity growth do indeed, create value. They create wealth. But think about how vicious the assumption that he's making is, that's embedded in his claim that productivity growth through innovation, through these robots, through these AI, is creating an underclass. What was he saying? He said the technology is going to create an underclass.
A permanent underclass.
A permanent underclass. That's absurd. You know what the technology does? The technology takes an order and it sends it back to be turned into a hamburger. Mm-hmm. That's what the technology does. Mm-hmm. The technology does not produce an underclass.
Right.
The policies that are inherent in his ideology are what create that underclass. Mm-hmm. What he's saying is that if you have productivity growth, that has to flow then up to the top, and then the poor have to get poorer. You could go back to Adam Smith, who famously talks about this was a needle factory or pin factory or whatever. And he's like, if it took 10 guys 40 hours a week to make 100 needles, and all of a sudden this new technology comes in where now you only need 5 guys to make those same amount of pins. Society has benefited significantly. Now, all those dudes only have to work 20 hours a week, and now they have 20 hours extra hours to spend with their family, to spend on leisure. The world has gotten to be a better place. Art Laffer says, no. That technology actually just impoverished half of the workers at this factory, and all the profits then go up to the factory owner, who now owns that innovation. That's his assumption of how the world ought to operate, and that's why that dude on the sidewalk is his handiwork.
See, I disagree, because I think, again, when you're looking at the policies, there are the people behind those policies, and I actually don't think that Art Laffer would disagree when you're talking about, pinning the blame on the policies as opposed to the technology in 2021. I mean, he advised Donald Trump, a populist president, and I think there is increasing recognition among some free marketeers, not all of them, and that's very true. We talked about the Koch brothers network on this program yesterday. It's absolutely true. They are one of the remaining factions of the conservative movement that is not aware, or has little regard for sort of the limits of market extremism. And so it's not everyone, but there is increasing, I think, awareness of how deals like NAFTA, those sorts of like global free market ideology, the things that, when you're looking at technology in places like McDonald's or on factory floors that displaced workers, et cetera, I think there is increasing awareness that is a failure of policy. And I agree with that completely. I could not defend that, and I wouldn't defend that. So I don't know that the right is entirely in disagreement with the idea that some of the policies are to blame. But one conversation I have with a lot of people on the right at the same time is that, look, business is how we live. It's been the way that people live forever, right? Like we sell things and we trade our value to have a comfortable life or to just get by, whatever it is. And so to some extent, we're going to need to have an economy.
Sure.
We can't get rid of an economy. And the basis of an economy is sort of like lifting people up with a well-regulated system. And I think it's perfectly fair to point to where the system has not been well-regulated. And I do agree that has been a failure of the conservative movement, who has sided with the notion that, this is too regulated, where I think it is too regulated in some places, like occupational licensing, too regulated. It's terrible for workers and hair salons and these basic jobs around the country where people get screwed by government regulations. Let's talk about that, absolutely. But at the same time, the corporatists have benefited from the system, and it has been bad for workers, right. And that should be easy to admit.
Right, and Laffer has been central to this idea that unemployment and inflation are directly linked, and that in order to keep inflation low, you have to keep unemployment high. You have to keep it above what he and others call a natural rate of unemployment. Economic research over the last couple decades has shown that is absolutely not true. That this was you could be very generous and call it a mistake in the 1970s to come up with this, but it has proven to be false. There is not a link between inflation and unemployment such that you have to organize policy around it. And so when he says that they're not worth $15 an hour to come to work, and that's right, they're actually worth $23 an hour. Now, if you go back to what wages were in the 1960s, the real minimum wage around $23 an hour, since then productivity growth has and the profits from it have all flown to the top, while wages have stayed flat. And so that's why you can have these CEOs making tens of millions of dollars while saying that they're worth that, but actually the workers aren't worth $15 an hour.
Right, and that is completely true. And something that is extremely annoying is that we don't actually know what anybody's worth, because the government subsidizes worth, by the way, which is a ridiculous way to talk about workers, but we don't actually know because the government subsidizes these companies with fake tax rates, and it's a complete cronyist capitalist system right now. So there's no fair way to say what anything is worth, because the government comes in and subsidizes the companies to the point where, and by the way, their CEOs take huge paychecks that are wildly out of whack with the sort of rate that, and Bernie Sanders talks about this a lot, where you have now CEOs making tens and tens, dozens of times more than their lower paid workers. And they're getting away with it by, these huge tax breaks that they don't actually pay the rates that they're supposed to pay. And that's why we don't have this very clear understanding of what a wage is, what that sort of like trade between skill and time looks like. And Ryan and I just got inadvertently into a very foundational debate between left and right. And we have more in this segment. Actually, if you can believe it, there is more. Lindsey Graham revealed that members of his own family were opting not to work due to unemployment benefits, saying, if you're working for $15 an hour, that makes you a chump. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, if you can get $20 to not work and $15 to work but people do want to work. They actually do want to leave the house. But meanwhile, chief economist at Indeed, Jed Kolko, tweeted job postings on the site reached above pre-pandemic baseline as of last Friday at 28.6%. So what do you make of how the number of job openings is unfolding, and how's that going to influence this wage conversation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it also is a foundational question. And on this time, where in the first half of this conversation, I would admit, I think there's been a huge failure on the part of the right. I think this side is where there's a failure on the part of the left to say that when you actually have like the UBI experiment that I think some people thought the stimulus checks might be, which is never a good argument. This was never going to be a representative case study of what UBI would look like because it's such a specific circumstance and context. But I think we're getting sort of the obvious answer to this experiment, which is that it does make it a lot harder to fill jobs that need to be filled. So it has risen up the wages. It's increased wages, but at the same time, I mean, I don't think anyone would argue that the way this is working out has been overall great.
Right. Yeah, and if the bonus unemployment is the Republicans' biggest sticking point with Biden, well, that's fading anyway, so
that's true.
We can all move on then.
Yeah.
And I guess he's just doing fine, according to them, as soon as those expire. More rising after this.